In this video, we're going to learn how to group variables into dialogues. In the previous videos, we've been developing this one-page sales agreement. We have created a handful of placeholders throughout the template associated with HotDocs variables. We specifically have three variables in the mix right now: a seller name, a buyer name, and then a price variable. And the last thing we did in the previous video is we clicked on the test button to see what kind of interview HotDocs generates based on what we've done in terms of development in the template thus far. We're going to do that again. I'm going to click on the test button, and we see a test interview here with those three HotDocs variables constituting separate items in the interview outline. So we have the seller name and then a corresponding answer field over here, the buyer name, corresponding answer field, and then another answer field for price. Three different variables, three different items in the interview outline. Now, for very simple templates that maybe have a handful of variables like this, it's not a huge deal to have each of those variables, generally speaking, come up as individual items in the outline. But if you have a more sophisticated template, a longer template with more variables, dozens, perhaps even hundreds of variables, you really don't want to have each of those constitute separate items in the interview outline with just one answer field over here in what we call the dialog view. That would be very tedious for a user to work through in order to complete that interview. So what we're going to do is consolidate that interview, and we're going to group related variables into what we call dialog components. To do that, I'm going to get into the Component Studio. So I'm clicking on the Component Studio button here on the HotDocs Author add-in. And that brings up a separate tool within HotDocs that gives us access to what we call the HotDocs component file. Now variables, and we're seeing the three variables here that we've created thus far. A variable is a type of component, as is a dialog that we can create here within Component Studio. I'm going to create a dialog by clicking on this New Component button. Now when I click on it, I get a drop down of the different kinds of components that I can create. And you can see if I wanted to, I could create more variables here by way of Component Studio. It's an alternative method of creating variables relative to what we saw in previous videos. But notice down here in this subsection of the drop down where it says Other Components, there is a dialog option. I'm going to click on that, and HotDocs then asks me what I want to name this dialog. The name of the dialog should, of course, be a reflection of the kinds of questions that you're going to be asking. What I'm going to do is take the buyer name and seller name variables and put them in this dialog. So I'm calling the dialog itself buyer and seller information. For right now, don't worry about this repetition option or setting. We will cover the idea of repetitions in another video. For right now, you can just leave it as none. That just basically means that this dialog will come up once and once only in the interview. I'm going to click on OK. And then within Component Studio, I can see on a separate tab here the buyer and seller information dialog. And then down here are a series of tabs containing various settings you can access to configure or modify the dialog itself. We're going to keep things simple and stay on the Contents tab. And all I want to do is take the buyer and the seller name variables, which are listed over here on the right-hand side of the screen, and I'm going to do a simple right to left drag and drop of both of those into the Contents tab here. So let me take seller name first. I'm just going to do a simple drag and drop. And you'll notice when I do that, it pulls the seller name variable into this Contents tab. It's no longer listed here on the right-hand side. If I do the same thing for buyer name, I do a simple drag and drop, and I just pull it underneath the seller name. So now I have two different variables in this buyer and seller information dialog. I can simply close Component Manager at this point, and now when I do a test, again going to the Test button on the HotDocs Author add-in, instead of seeing three items in the interview outline like I saw earlier, buyer and seller have been consolidated into the new dialog that I created, and HotDocs is displaying the name of that dialog here as buyer and seller information. Now I can answer both of those questions within that single dialog, that single item in the interview outline. Through this process of grouping variables in dialogs, I can consolidate the number of items that users have to work through in the interview. That results in a better flow to the interview. It streamlines the interview process, which is particularly helpful for longer, more complex templates. So as we continue to develop this and other templates, we can group variables in dialogs, and in so doing make for a better user experience.